bit of a story, I guess you could say. But I was born in upstate New York. I hadn't seen a person of color until I moved to Miami, and I quickly became a minority myself. And I think that growing up in a similar life circumstances, Charles, very close to people of many different cultures, I still think not until this Black Lives Matter emerged, like maybe 6 months ago, I don't think I had connected the dots and truly understood like what's going on here. And one of the things that sticks out to me is I think that these things are so spaced out. And I think that, I think to Charles' point, I don't know if the government has been plotting against Black people, like in and of itself through the history of time up to today. But I do think that potentially the behaviors of different individuals in concert has created oppression. And one of the things that sticks out to me and something that didn't occur to me, I think, and maybe I'm seeing this the wrong way, so somebody say it if I'm out of place, but I think if you think about the murder of Martin Luther King, like that was an individual who transcended this subject and was accomplishing a lot. And at the crescendo of that, he was murdered and killed specifically for what he was promoting and what he was saying. So I think that that's not the government that did that, or who knows, conspiracy theories, maybe they had some connection.
Or maybe it was. Right?
Or maybe it was. I mean, who knows? Either way, he was killed. And I think that is like the cherry on top, forgive the analogy, to the history on this subject, because the one individual who truly was leading from the front and transcending on the subject was murdered. That's oppressive. And I think that in tandem with all these other things going on is very relevant to this subject. So I guess that's the period. That's the end of the statement. But, I do think that it might not be a plot of one individual, but I think maybe the collection of individual behaviors has created this degree of oppression.
Yeah. And real quick, I agree definitely with that. That's why I use terms like mind frame, because, other than the individual, because obviously this span beyond generations, there's a mind frame and customs that are passed on. And also, just a quick, I don't know if y'all know about Oliver North. Anybody know about Oliver North? Todd and Steven, you might know Todd in the 1980s. I remember being a young child watching them on CNN News like every day, tied into the Iran-Contra scandal, which tied into Ricky Ross, a lot of documentaries about this, LA, which basically, to sum it up, he testified at Capitol Hill. They were able to prove under the Reagan administration that the government involved with bringing in cocaine. They had Colombian drug lords who actually protected under the witness protection program, according to Ricky Ross, who actually got locked up for a long time and got his sentence reduced. They were bringing the drugs and they brought in crack to the hood. They were bringing the drugs in the Oliver North Iran-Contra scandal as the proof of how the government was working through the CIA and working with Colombian drug lords. This is on record. So this is information that a lot of people may not know of now, maybe not old enough, or this information just suppressed. This is something that I personally didn't have to see to know what they were doing. I know that we don't have no boats like that. We're not going to get the drugs and stuff like that. So I know that shit off there. But that's just the technical part. So like I said, some things can play a part, but I'm not going to use that as the source of I'm going to use my real life common sense and what I know about how life works, and I'm going to use the data as secondary. But that's just the case looking to Oliver North to prove how the government was bringing in drugs into the hoods and brought in crack. So that again shows some of the technical definition of the intent, But look into the Oliver North Iran-Contra scandal.
I don't think you have to discount the statistics, Your Highness. Right. I think a lot of them actually support some of the things that you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not discounting it. It's not the primary. That's what I'm saying. It definitely it's a tool. It's definitely useful. It's not the number one.
So for Richard and Charles, I kind of get your points, right? But I think you're both doing a decent amount of discounting on the uniqueness of the Black experience in the U.S. And I don't think you can separate the historical aspects of racism from the systemic issues that currently exist today, some of which are the resultant from some of those historical aspects, right? So, and I want to like kind of take it as a little bit of like a Q&A because I'm curious on what your feedback is. So like, what do you think like redlining is? Like when you hear like redlining, right? This is like mid 1900s where Black people were universally denied particular services, the ability to get access to particular loans, to own property in certain areas, the impacts of which we're still seeing today, right? Because you got like 80% of Black and Hispanic people, or above 80% of Black Hispanic people, their only source of assets are their checking accounts, right? So you're seeing a lot of the impacts of those in comparisons to lineages that were allowed to get access to some of these things and live in certain neighborhoods and create wealth through their property, which is the primary source of wealth within the United States. When you see something like that, do you not think that's systemic? Like, do you?
You want me to go, or you want Rich to go? Who's going?
Whoever. I'm curious about what your feedbacks are. Whoever.
I don't hear Rich, so I'm going to go. I just want to. I mean, I feel like I categorize this pretty well. I think outcomes today, right? Like the playing field, so to speak, that the Black community at large is on is the result of history. I don't want to discount that. And so what you're talking about to me is history.
Mm-hmm.
What the point that I'm making, and in 2020, there is not a conspiracy to keep Black people down or to see that Black people are killed by the police or whatever. I look at our current situation as the circumstances that be, brought to us by history for sure, but that going forward, no one's going to stop anybody, and that a proactive look at policies and what their effects are at a sort of emotionless level to a degree. And obviously you don't want to divorce emotion completely. Steve made and so did Your Highness, made strong points that we can't divorce those ideas because we can definitely incorporate them. But I think there's a difference to say that there's a conspiracy to harm Black people that like runs the country currently, as opposed to things that happened in the past that set us back and that we can address for sure.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, I understand your point. So let me bring it more current then.
Please.
What do you think the past year, right now, actually not even past year, within the past month, felons, right? Let's keep it home, right? Your state, Florida. Felons were allowed, the public universally, the majority, I think it was like 75%, agreed that we should give felons the right to vote again, right? The people agreed, legislation passed. The government, the legislature, despite the will of the people, added additional regulations in place to prevent those people from the right to vote, right? So they're saying you need to pay off X, Y, Z, you got to do all these things before you can have the right to vote again. That impacts overwhelmingly the Black and Hispanic community because those are the individuals who are trying to seek the right to vote, right? How is that not systemic? That happened this year.
I don't think that I'm making the case that isn't systemic. I'm making the case that even though it impacts Black people at a larger percentage or Black and brown people at a larger percentage, it's not a play directly against Black and brown people. It's a play for power. Those Black and brown people are more likely to vote in a direction that would prevent people who even put that rule in place anyway that you just mentioned. They're just trying to hold on the power. It's not like
you're breaking up a little bit, brother.
I specifically want black and brown felons to suffer harder.
I can't hear you, brother. You're breaking up.
Before I'm going to prevent them the right to vote. My bad. I guess the point that I was making is that I don't think the intent is to hurt Black and brown felons so much as it is I'm willing to sacrifice the experience of Black and brown felons in order to make them power.
I think you're divorcing. You're divorcing. Hold on one second. You're divorcing things too much, Richard.
Hello?
Like, yes, they want to remain in power, but you have to remember
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
After this, we're gonna let Steve get in because we've been waiting for a while.
Yeah.
So make a comment, and then we gotta go.
So I think you're like divorcing things, right? Like, yes, they want to remain in power, but they're remaining in power to implement policies that specifically impact those people. They don't want them to vote because they're voting for things that are in their interest, right? Like, that's what you want to do. You have the right to vote because you're voting for someone who's going to, whether it's at the representative or executive level, for someone who's going to enact policies that are going to be beneficial to you and people more likely that look like you. And so when you're disenfranchised from the ability to vote, one of like the fundamental rights that we have in this country, yes, they do want to stay in power, but it's not like an empty question, right? I mean, an empty statement. They want to stay in power because they want their policies to be moved forward and their policies that are beneficial to people who are like
But there
them
are
or
black
in their
people in
sphere.
their party, though. Like,
There are,
that would
but
benefit from that. You know what I mean?
absolutely, but you don't look at it like that, right? Like, that's like saying, like, you know, like you don't look at like this
It's a
small
political
sliver,
issue with racial outcomes.
Okay,
right?
let's get Steve in here.
Just one more point, and then it's all Steve. One more point. When it comes to when it comes to racial issues, you have to look at it through a different lens, given the context of the history here, right? Like, when there's an application of a rule and it overwhelmingly impacts one particular community, even though on its face it might seem neutral, you have to look at it through a different lens, right? Because historically, that's what's happened always, right? They're like separate but equal. Well, okay, like on its face, sounds perfectly okay, right?
Yeah.
They're separate and they're equal, but like we know, like in retrospect, that obviously those things aren't equal. So whenever you're looking at like the application of these kind of rules, especially if they're overwhelmingly impacting marginalized groups, you have to look at it through a different like standard of review, and you have to look at it, and the ability to justify its implementation needs to go way up, right? It has to be almost flawless, just because it's overwhelmingly impacting these people. So I think you guys I understand your point. I understand what you're saying, and that like facially, it's like, whoa, what's wrong with asking these people to repay their fees, right? Like, why not? You know, and they don't necessarily want to hurt these individual felons. They want, to remain in power, but all of these things are inextricably linked. I don't think you can keep cutting out like what the actual resultant impacts of these things are. You can't like, take them apart like this.
All right, we're going Steve.
Yeah. So I'll start with it's in order for it can't be a conspiracy if there's a track record, and we have to look at the track record. You say, okay, there's no conspiracy, well, there's a track record of these practices from a governmental standpoint. And you made mention of redlining. Slavery was a government initiative. Jim Crow, segregation, all those are governmental initiatives. So these are the things. These are the pieces that make it that where the conversations, just miss each other, where they miss each other. So if you believe wholeheartedly, okay, no, it's about the individual. It's about the individual. It's not systemic. And okay, then we're missing each other. It just doesn't intersect. Something that was mentioned before and something that I do agree with, but see, there's a balance. And see, I bring up a lot of things dealing with the history, but the other part too is this, because he said something that was very, very real and something that we have to look as, especially as Black people, is the self-determination piece. See, because there are too many that are using that are, hey, slavery, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem. Now, I'm all about evaluating what we do have, what we can do to get out of it, and to look at it from a generational standpoint, because this is something that's not going to end overnight. You're talking about over 500 years. So understanding the truth of what happened, understanding that that it is government, understanding that it is a power issue, and just like you mentioned before about maintaining power. If you're going to maintain power, that means power gained for one group is power denied for another. That's just how it works. And when it comes down to so-called race is just at a contest of power. It's about power. So although on the face of it, it's like, okay, no, we're not going to specifically target this group of people, but yes, you are targeting, because in order to maintain power, you have to deny power. In order to maintain this insane imbalance of power, you have to insanely deny power to another group. But then it's on. I'm a strong proponent of being self-determined as a people. That there are some things that we need to do. Understand the truth of how we got here, but also to understand the resources that we have in order to come up and say, okay, this is not working for us. This is what we're dealing with. And so once you know what you're dealing with, now you can put together a strategy to come up and come out.
Yes, I definitely want to. But go ahead, Richard. Then I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point. I think it's important to talk about how we define like these things that we're talking. We're talking about like very heavy topics like systemic racism, historical racism, just racism generally. And I think it's important to say that at least I'm not going to speak for Charles, but for me, I'm not suggesting that systemic racism isn't a thing. I'm not suggesting that historical racism it doesn't have impacts today. What I'm saying is that how that thought process gets applied today isn't necessarily productive for what a solution looks like. And my fear is that we're creating this sort of conundrum that we can't get from under, right? Because everything, negative thing that happens in our lives, or shortcoming or disparity in numbers or feeling or whatever metric you want to use, can be ascribed to systemic and historical racism. And the point that I'm making is that there's this whole other part of the solution that we still haven't solved yet. That is, we as a society, whether you agree, let me just say this from my perspective, are as least racist as we've ever been. And I know that there are people who don't think that, but I legitimately in my heart believe that there are less racist people and less racist systems in place right now than there have ever been as it pertains to Black people in America. And so the point that I'm making is that is moving in that direction. But I think that there's a cultural piece that is a product of some of the history, right? But regardless of that fact, there is a cultural piece that we as individuals have to own, and we don't, as often as I think we should, take that into account when things happen, right? So, and again, I'm not suggesting that racism isn't real. I'm not suggesting that the impact is minimal. I'm saying that because there's this complex issue, both for the way that we handle it personally, but also the way that we handle it systemically. And we haven't addressed, rather, I feel like we don't address the personal side of it as often or as easily as we do some of the systemic impacts.
I can definitely, I can see where you're coming from with that, Rich. I mean, just to clear my perspective, I mean, Charles, you heard me say this before, and Steve, like, I always come with the self-responsibility aspect first. Regardless of subject, I think it's wise for the individual to look at themselves, and regardless of any issue or any kind of situation you may be in, to see what you possibly have contributed to it. I just think that's a healthy mindset. Now, I can definitely tell you, from just as a Black experience, most of us in a case that are not, like you said, Richard, like you said, it's like you can't get from under it. That literally, virtually is impossible to get from quote unquote under it, because we've been weakened to a state mentally, physically, and spiritually, not by anybody else, but by our own doings. You know what I'm saying? By our own doings. And now we're in a situation that we're looking, for the most part, not all of us, looking for someone always to bail us out. And that's that savior complex. That's a lot of things. That's a lot where religion gets into it. It actually makes one more docile, and it trains your mind to think in a certain way that you're now self-empowered. You know what I'm saying? So now we're looking for more of a handout. We almost accepted the role of a second class citizen. Like you said, some black people look like, hey, I'm doing good, but it really depends on what your agenda is in life. Some people, for instance, and this is not to anybody here or just anybody in particular, some people are more content with getting $20, so to speak, per hour than $10 an hour. Some people are realize that that's nowhere near what their value is and what they represent. But so some people are like, hey, I'm getting a little more, so I think we're doing better. But you're not really still. Everybody in society is getting devalued, regardless of your nationality or ethnic background. And when some, just particularly speaking for myself and for some black people that have an awareness of what we are and what we represent, knowing that the value is getting capped off and restricted, and not willing to settle for that, you have to find ways, and that's us looking internally within ourselves. And I think it's up to the ones the responsibility to at least see what's going on, to point out to the other ones, to at least bring it and put it in a certain perspective so they can get the inspiration off knowing the real hardcore facts, because all the tactics has been used up to this point. A lot of truth has been spoken, but honestly, this shit obviously is not working. And I think with us as black people, the hardest thing I notice is the principle of acceptance. We see it, we can speak about it, a lot of this talking amongst ourselves, but our behavior show otherwise, that we haven't accepted even what we're speaking about is happening to us. Because if you do accept it and you accept it for what it is, then you'll know how to honestly reverse it. But it's still this question mark that seems to be overhanging a lot of people's head, like, I don't know what to do, just kind of settle for second place instead of really accepting the real nature of what's going on, being educated about it, and applying the discipline it's going to take to get from up or under it, that we honestly put our own selves in. Because when you study the history outside of the U.S., when the civilizations leading up to the U.S., from European and then based from African and East African territories, there's a whole history. Everything is chronologically tied up. A lot of times we're compartmentalizing today's situation and chopping off. We're either by ignorance, because we just have a lack of knowledge of what happened yesterday, or we just don't really want to face it, or we learn only from a certain point up to this matter. Because a lot of this shit goes back even before the inception of the U.S. When you talk about lineage and cultural and customs and traditions that are still used for Roman Empire practices. And this is real. This is when you start to get into education about just human sociology and how everything developed from societies and the certain practices that we're using even from BC time that are holding up the pillars of society. All this shit kind of ties in together. So I definitely know for a fact that most of us, not all, are just, it's a sense of defeat, because we just don't really want to accept the truth. Our behavior, we complain a lot about it, but our behavior is showing that we're not accepting it. We're still thinking it's going to be all right, that they're quote unquote going to help us out and do right by us one day. It's not really going to happen like that. You know what I'm saying? That anytime you look in societies, people have to honestly stand up for their rights and take back their dignity and pride to become somewhere strong. No one gave that shit to you. It never ever happens like that when society oppresses people. Historically, thousands of years beyond before the inception of the United States of America as we presently know it. So this is something that's been going on worldwide. And all these things play a factor. And I think a lot of people are just either not educated enough, or they're choosing to keep their blinders on about expanding their knowledge and wisdom on certain things. So they're acting and speaking from childlike perspectives, honestly. And it's not adding up to the real severity of the problem, what's really going on.
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything you said, Richard, by the way.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I don't think what I said sorry, Steve. Yeah, I was just saying I don't disagree with you, Richard.
Yeah, I got Steve
because when it comes down to it, it boils down. What it boils down to is that self-determination. That we have to take the reins and take responsibility for what it is that where we want to go as a people. But see, this is the thing. There's a conditioning that has happened over these 500 years.
Yes.
And see, that conditioning was based on processes that has actually taken the mentality of the group mentality. And the expectation is extremely low. And that's where you get that. So when you get a so-called ghetto, a ghetto is not the buildings, it's the mentality. How did that many people in one area have that little bit of expectation? How is it that in this area, the expectation of their adult life and what they're going to obtain in their adult life is just in the gutter in comparison to those who come up in Beverly Hills? That's that's something that's actually, those are conditions and conditionings that are in place. that affect that. But now, once you understand that it's a process, it is on us to understand that it is a process and to develop our processes to get out. Because that's why it seems so insurmountable, because a lot of times we'll say things like, the individual. I got to say, divide and conquer, individualize and control. So the reality is, we have to understand this. When you take it out of being systemic, that means you don't deal with a collective. And if you're not going to deal with it as a collective, then you truly not in a position to deal with it. And then here comes the sense of, what do we? I can't do nothing about this because I can't. We can, but I does not stand a chance where we can win. That's the reality. So I'm in agreement with that. Talking about the problem. It has to get to the point of responsibility, accountability, holding each other accountable, and working together and realizing that, okay, this is the problem. This is how we got here. These are the processes, and start working these processes, and also understanding that the Messiah is not coming. And even if we start, unity, we got to come together in unity. We come together in unity, but it'll still be a process that's going to take time.
I definitely, when this is relevant, I want